few days ago, I noticed a lot of people were posting tweets in threads and whatnot, appreciating Pixar's The Incredibles. And I believe they initially started with this one thread right here, where they were talking about stuff the movie somehow got away with, despite being kind of adultish, dark stuff that probably shouldn't be in a kid's movie.
And while I've continued to be a fan of animated media,
I haven't really watched The Incredibles since I was like maybe 5 or so years old. I remember the broad strokes, and a lot of stuff I didn't initially remember from the movie I kind of filled up with watching tons of reviews and video essays about it and whatnot, because that's how we do. Again, I'm an animation fan. I watch tons of videos talking about this stuff, so I kind of do and have known the movie for all of my life. But seeing all this hype that suddenly came up again and realizing just how much I actually had forgotten, I decided to rewatch the movie again recently. And after finishing it again, I noticed that The Incredibles isn't exactly a kid's movie. Lots of people are really nostalgic about early 2000s era Pixar nowadays. People who grew up with these movies are slowly becoming adults at this point in time. And of course, lots of nostalgia is gonna pop up and people are gonna start appreciating them again. And while most of them get tons of love in general, I've noticed that the movies directed by Brad Bird in particular seem to get a special attention from the more critically inclined. You know, video essayists, people who do analysis, all that kind of stuff. You can notice it in, for example, Shafrila's Productions video on Ratatouille, which he states to be the studio's magnum opus. And in that video, and many others talking about Brad Bird's movies, you always see this quote from a guy pop up.
People think of animation only doing things where people are dancing around and doing a lot of histrionics, but animation is not a genre. And people keep saying, the animation genre. It's not a genre. A Western is a genre. Animation is an art form, and it can do any genre. You know, it could do a detective film, a cowboy film, a horror film, an R-rated film, or a kid's fairy tale. But it doesn't do one thing. And next time I hear, oh, what's it like working in the animation genre? I'm gonna punch that person.
And I think this philosophy can be seen in tons of his movies. As it's always pointed out, not only The Incredibles, but pretty much every one of his animated flicks kind of tackle topics that are a little bit more broad than you would initially expect from an animated movie. They don't really talk down to the audience as much, they just talk about the thing. Tell a movie in the medium of animation. It can be just about anything as long as it fits the animation medium and is trying to tell a good story. And I've always recognized that to be true, but I never really noticed the extent of it until I rewatched The Incredibles.
look, I think if you talk down to a kid or specifically aim at a kid, most kids aren't gonna like it. Really, because most kids can feel when you're being patronizing. And if you're making entertainment that you yourself wouldn't watch, I think there's something insulting about that. People have gone the other way and asked, not only to me, but about Pixar in general, how do you guys do just the right balance? As though there's some really complex equation that we follow. It's really, really simple. We make films that we ourselves would want to see, and then hope that other people will want to see it.
And just from frame one, the movie already opens up in this retro-style interview with the heroes, and you can really see how the movie treats these characters as more like characters than just superheroes that are supposed to do the fun action things. Mr. Incredible's first line is literally him like picking up the microphone and like checking if it's on and stuff, and you can get to see their answers, you get to see them talking about their lives and what they plan to do in the future, and this kind of extends to the whole movie. It always feels like that despite this being a superhero movie, it de-emphasizes the superhero stuff to focus more on a character-driven story with a little bit of social commentary on the side even. You get to see this especially in the first 30 or so minutes of the movie, where there's actually very few action scenes. It's mostly focused on this very slow burn as you see Mr. Incredible's life go from its peak to it surrounding him taking care of his family and going to his boring job in his office and him being really unhappy with it. And it really puts in the time to actually make it feel believable and weirdly realistic from a character standpoint. When I say this movie isn't holding anything back, I mean it. One of the main drivers of the initial plot is a suicide attempt. One of the reasons why superheroes were turned illegal in the movie in the first place was the fact that the dude tried to kill himself, and then when Mr. Incredible saved him, the guy sued him for stopping his suicide, which is like, I don't know, it's kind of ridiculous, it's kind of funny. I wouldn't necessarily call it realistic per se, but it's just ridiculous enough in a dark enough context to feel more like an absurd form of social commentary almost. It's treating like real world issues in a little bit of an absurd way, but it's the kind of absurd way you often see in real life where you don't believe it's actually real until you see it happening. Kind of weird stuff you see on the news and you can't quite believe it until you read it twice. And speaking of superhero stories where superheroes are turned illegal, whose plots are set in motion by someone falling off a building, isn't this like weirdly similar to Watchmen? This movie is weirdly similar to Watchmen, which, if you don't know, is this comic book series that's basically this huge deconstruction of what superheroes are and are supposed to be, and basically ask what if superheroes were in this real, very greedy, very messed up world, and every one of them isn't really that much of a good person. I haven't seen anyone make this comparison yet, but the more I think about it, the more these two different stories seem more alike. And when the movie picks up, you get to see Bob doing his boring office job at an insurance company, and he helps this old lady out at figuring out the bureaucracy of getting the things she needs, even though the company doesn't want him to help her out because they kind of profit off the complicated, weird stuff insurance companies make you do to waste more time and money
Trying to do the stuff you actually want to do.
And like at age 5, when I first watched this movie, I didn't even know what insurance was. Let alone that I have to deal with this kind of bureaucracy. I would only find out what messing with documentation and stuff and how complicated that can be really feels like in my mid to late teens. So yeah, I don't know what kid they were trying to attract with that. Answer, none. And as I mentioned before, after that the movie explores the meaning of superheroes and treating all these characters as people who kind of like fell off from this huge movement, this huge thing that was once their job. Basically like a weird sort of mass layoff, if you think about it. Sort of what artists are afraid of facing once AI starts picking up. But that's under, here and there. And it all feels, again, remarkably realistic. In the scene where Bob gets back home and sees his family again, we see that big family fight at the dinner table. And of course, it's all kind of emphasized by the powers that the kids have and stuff. It's still just sort of like, it's the same kind of mundane, day-to-day family fight that you might see in any normal, real dinner table. And you also get to see it again, Bob's midlife crisis. Once he gets into that whole room he has, that's basically like an altar for his quote-unquote glory days, filled of newspaper stuff and his old costumes and basically merch that he just kept around for the sake of nostalgia, I suppose, and attachment to the time where he was allowed to be a hero. There's the whole scene where Bob and Frozone hang out and they go bowling, but in reality they're just lying to their wives so they can do undercover hero work because they still just enjoy it so much. They get in trouble for it. They eventually figure it out. It's fine, but it's so interesting. Like in that scene when they're in the car and Frozone is telling that story about a villain that was monologuing and he caught the villain monologuing. It feels, again, props to the actors because it feels very, very natural, very realistic. Like two friends who were in the same line of work years ago and they kind of understand the whole gist of things, so they're just sharing stories about it, being nostalgic. These guys are in their 40s probably, and they're getting to that point in life where being nostalgic for the stuff like this, it's normal, it's realistic, you see it all the time. Just go to any fancy adult party with wine and shit and see what they talk about. It's always this kind of weird reminiscing where they're finishing each other's words and they always write and they start laughing about it. They really got the vibe right on that one specific conversation. Of course, right after that, the plot truly picks up because then Mr. Incredible gets the call, he goes do that undercover work, and after he gets fired, that's the only way he can support his family. And funny thing, I didn't know the uncanny Mr. Incredible song was actually in the movie. I had forgotten that. So I actually started laughing out loud when the montage picked up and the song started playing. And of course, I cannot talk about the montage without mentioning the fucking butt slap scene. If you know, you know. Again, one of those things that seems weirdly adult for this quote-unquote kids movie. And eventually, yeah, of course, Elastigirl starts suspecting something's wrong, and then she finds that hair in his clothes, and suddenly she thinks the guy's cheating on her, which is, again, a weirdly adult plot point for this kids movie. But anyways, while Elastigirl's figuring things out, Mr. Incredible continues to do his job over at that remote island and stuff. And in those scenes, something else I noticed is how the directing is also really delicate and good. It's not like those generic kids movies you see nowadays, or a lot of the time. Even current Pixar stuff, to an extent, they're kind of hit or miss nowadays. This movie really has a knack for different sort of camera shots and snapping between different angles in a way that feels meaningful and deliberate. It's very delicate directing, the kind of thing you usually see in the movies people always are praising, the stuff that goes to the Oscars. You really got to see that in the Kronos scene, you know, that part where Mr. Incredible finds out what Syndrome's plan actually is, and he opens the computer. And then there's those, like, at the same time, we're also seeing Elastigirl figure out where Mr. Incredible actually is and what he's doing. And it's all paired up with the music in a very intense and, I don't want to say satisfying because it doesn't feel good at the time, but it gets you very invested in the story. It's the kind of like peak of tension in both of these stories. It's the character figuring something out that completely changes their trajectory, and it's paired up with this awesome, intense music that's also been memed to now. And it's a very iconic scene. This movie likes those iconic scenes. It's a reason why people quote it, even to this day. People meme about it and stuff, because it's one of those movies that's very concerned with being quality. And I'm not just talking from like a baseline, okay, good writing, passable for the kids, or just passable in general standpoint. It's a movie that clearly is trying to stand out, and you really got to see that with the directing. Of course, we have that intense scene where like the plane blows up and then Mr. Incredible thinks it's suddenly his dad. And after that, there's a whole thing where, again, another weirdly dark moment where Elastigirl tells the kids, okay, these guys, they're not like Saturday morning villains. They will actually kill you if they get the chance. But in this scene especially, you got to see, again, this sort of Watchmen aspect pop up again, which is where I feel like this movie really shines, almost, where it really stands out from other superhero stories. Is that, in a way, this movie is not really as much of a superhero movie as much as it is a parody of superhero movies. And I don't say this in a hugely comical sort of way where it just tries to satirize everything superheroes are all about. It's, weirdly enough, and it feels weird saying this about a Pixar movie of all things, it's a deconstruction of superhero stories. And I've been talking about deconstructions a lot in this channel lately, but really, think about it. There's this character talking about how the typical bad guys that are actually messed up criminals who can do bad stuff to people. There's, again, the very Watchmen approach to things where they treat these characters as humans first, who are flawed and lead general, you know, archetypical human lives that would befit the real world. You basically see another version of the same question Watchmen asks, which is, what if superheroes exist in the real world? Of course, it's in a sort of an absurd, animated Disney way, but still, it's not every superhero movie that's gonna go out and star a middle-aged man in his midlife crisis, of all things. That sounds boring, but nah, this movie asks what if and goes with it. It takes the idea of the family struggle, all the angst and conflict that comes with it, and including the older characters who usually don't get this much of a spotlight in animated media, and inserts that into the context of a superhero universe. Of course, it's not gonna do huge governmental commentary in the same way Watchmen does, because that's, of course, an actual adult story that's able to tackle a lot more stuff. But as far as kind of following that same general idea, I feel like people really don't compare these stories enough. They're oddly similar. The Incredibles is in a way sort of like kids' first Watchmen. And you even get to see the deconstruction of the Robin archetype with Syndrome. How he just pops up and he's this huge Mr. Incredible fan and he thinks he's gonna be able to follow the footsteps of his hero, but nah, dude messed up. Mr. Incredible wasn't having none of that, and he basically created his own villain. And not saying Syndrome was actually justified, not at all, but again, the character flaws shine through here. It's a story about characters who act certain ways and can make mistakes, and then that develops into a whole web of misunderstandings and just questionable actions that lead into the plot of the movie. That's way more dense than something like bad guy tries to destroy the world or take over the world, good guys gotta stop him. Which, even though Marvel movies try to do a whole lot of set dressing to make it a little more complex in different ways, still ultimately add up to kind of that. And they have motivations, but it's still good guy stop the bad guy action scene here. It's different from this. This is a character story, and it's not something a normal kid would initially understand. And going back to Syndrome, on top of like satirizing the typical superhero sidekick, he also satirizes the typical superhero fanboy in real life. The kind of fanboy who would actually find it hilarious that Mr. Incredible fucked Elastigirl. Hold up, that's actually canon and in the movie.
Oh no. Elastigirl? You married Elastigirl? Oh, and got busy!
And you even get to see a little bit more of that, including Syndrome, in the bonus content they have for the movie's DVDs. That includes the short Jack Jack attack, which is basically just a little, what could have been even a deleted scene from the movie, showing the babysitter trying to take care of Jack Jack, which then ends on this incredible joke by Syndrome that, again, somehow they got away with.
You're my replacement! Thank heaven you've come! What does S stand for?
For sitter. Yeah, sitter. Originally, I was going to have initials for babysitter, but then I would have been going around wearing a big BS, and you understand why I couldn't go with that.
And you believed him.
And then there's also the audio files that, in context of the story, are confidential government files documenting each of the heroes and their powers so they can keep control over them. You get to see how much actually went into designing these basically background characters and their relationship to each other in this little world that the creators of the movie made here.
Well, let's see. I started out in Arizona and then migrated over to Los Angeles, which was great. I had a great long run there. A lot of work to be done. A lot of superheroes see Los Angeles as kind of a launching ground, and to be honest with you, I didn't have a lot of places to launch to from there. The solar-powered thing, it's good for the environment, but it's not so good for me. It limits my ability. It limits my work hours. It makes me look like an idiot if something happens at night. Really, it's really hard when it's nighttime for me because I'm a rather social person. I like to dance. I like to go out to dinner, and if something horrible happens, my power's not going on because the sun's not out, and so it can be frustrating at times. Unless evil breaks out at a tanning salon, I'm done for.
And at the end of the day, it's kind of funny how this movie is marketed and presented as this family of superheroes standing up and fighting evil, and how there's even, stuff like a licensed video game and whatnot. Because after rewatching the movie, isn't this weirdly antithetical to what the movie is and is all about? It's not explicitly anti-hero in the same way something like, again, Watchmen would be. In fact, it's very much pro-hero, but it's still focuses way more on the character side of things than the superhero side of things. I understand they probably did it like this because they wanted it to be marketable to kids, and kids aren't interested in deep character analysis. They're more interested in superheroes. But still, it's funny looking at the movie's banner on Disney Plus and describes superhero family stands up once again or something, when the movie's actual message and content couldn't be further away from that, really. And in my opinion, not to get too much into the second movie, especially because I haven't rewatched it for this video, haven't watched it since it came out, but I think most people can agree, it's kind of whatever, it's kind of mediocre, most people didn't like it. I thought it was okay at first, but the more I think about it, the more I realize why it kind of fumbles, which is exactly this. It's closer to a straight-faced hero movie than the original in almost every way. In an era where we're always getting superhero content all the time, contrary to when the original movie came out, that was before the MCU, now we're getting superhero movies all the dang time. And instead of taking this opportunity to really dig into that criticism side of things and analyze the tropes and archetypes of superheroes in a more realistic, familial context, they made the second Incredibles even more like an archetypical superhero movie, which just makes it blend in more. Okay, yeah, you do have Mr. Incredible trying to take care of Jack, and also he helps Dash with his math homework and stuff, but that honestly kind of just adds up to a little bit of comic relief. Even though, yeah, the Screenslaver does have sort of a deconstructive backstory, it's to a way lesser extent than Syndrome, and it honestly feels like it could fit right into a typical superhero story, the ones that trying to be sort of superficially deconstructive. Like, yeah, it's saying something about their heroes, it's not necessarily shallow, but like if a new DC villain came up and had this very exact backstory, I wouldn't be surprised at all. It's literally the kind of move these sort of superhero stories try to pull nowadays to seem a little bit more deep. That said, the original movie is still definitely worth a rewatch, and if you haven't seen it in a while and you want to experience all these interesting little things the movie presents by yourself, go ahead and do it. It's a great time. With that said, that's about all I wanted to talk about today. If you enjoyed this, please give this video a like. If you didn't, please let me know where I can improve in the comments below. I'm always open to feedback. And thanks very much for watching. See you guys next time.